literature on game design across sort of all the major textbooks that people like to look at, you'll find sort of three major themes popping up. And so one is that game design is iterative. We all like to talk about we have to build things over and over and over again, failing fast, finding fun. There's a heavy emphasis on player experience, which I don't think would surprise anybody in this room. And there's also a heavy emphasis on the major interdisciplinarity of game design, in that most game design is done by more than one person, and in fact, usually many people of diverse backgrounds and perspectives. And so a major piece of the process of doing game design is understanding feedback within this iterative loop. And when you think about feedback in game design, many of us probably go immediately to the concept of playtesting, because it's kind of like our sort of personal special method that game design kind of has. But if you look at broader design practice, there's sort of these other notions of other kinds of feedback that happen in the process, and in particular, peer feedback. And so our lab at CMU has been doing a bunch of work on peer feedback, but more in a pedagogical context. So how do we understand the process of doing peer feedback in a classroom? But then we started to wonder of what does peer feedback actually look like in the industry? And are we actually teaching it the way that it actually gets used? And we found that nobody had really studied peer feedback in the games industry very much. And so that's where we set out on this study. So really, we're trying to answer this question of how do professional game designers make use of peer feedback within their processes? And so what we did was a semi-structured interview study. We reached out to 2 game studios. One was about a mid-size, about 50 employees, primarily mobile game studio. We got 10 interviews from there. And then the second studio was much smaller, about 15 employees, contract serious game studio, where we got 2 interviews from. We did a bunch of iterative development of codes, much more detail on that in the paper, and we talk about lots of things like peer feedback venues, types of feedback, but what I really want to focus on in this talk is this peer feedback cycle. But there's much more about all of this in the paper. So the peer feedback cycle was sort of this 6-stage process that we arrived at by looking at a bunch of different sort of vignettes of peer feedback experience. And it goes through 6 stages of planning feedback, preparing to receive feedback, presenting artifacts, exchanging feedback, processing feedback, and acting on feedback. And what I want to try to do is dig into each one of these stages, provide a little bit of context, and then talk about how we might use this process. So the first stage is planning feedback, and this includes things like first realizing feedback is even necessary, deciding who you want to be reaching out to, how you want to be reaching out to them, and also sort of planning your feedback timeline. So how long is this going to be? Is it going to be a quick conversation? Is it going to be a whole week-long meeting thing? And so a representative quote is, I try to schedule it so that even if it's myself and the head of the design team, and like the designers of that game specifically would participate. So they're thinking about who's going to be in the room and who am I going to reach out to. And we saw some interesting differences in this based on who was initiating the process. So if a feedback receiver was initiating the process, they often had a goal in mind, even if they couldn't articulate it. They kind of knew what they were getting into. But there were some interesting distinctions when other people started the process. So feedback providers can start off things, and they often seem disruptive. So a random passerby saying, hey, maybe you should look at this part of your art. But there were also people that valued that kind of insight because it had no context whatsoever about where the game was in its current process, and having that kind of non sequitur feedback can sometimes help them break creative roadblocks. And then when third parties, like managers, higher-ups, would initiate feedback, that was often seen as like an obligation. You have to participate because your boss said so. But there were some people who appreciated that those higher people might actually have broader context on where this game needs to be at like the studio level in terms of timeline. The second stage is preparing to receive feedback, and we distinguish this one from planning as essentially this is the concrete actions to facilitate feedback. So this is things like creating initial builds that you might send to somebody, maybe creating surveys that you might give to your team, and also reaching out and doing all the logistical planning and such if that's necessary. And so a classic representative quote of this is, I send them a build via link, I post that in Slack, send out an email, announce it at a company meeting, and then create a document that anyone could access so they could write their feedback on. That's a particularly well-organized person. Then the next stage is presenting feedback, and this is where they share materials to be viewed, and this could be anything from just dropping a piece of art in Slack and saying, hey, take a look when you get a chance. Could be actually having a formal presentation with slides and everything and like a pitch process, or it could be sort of reaching out and doing like a formal testing internally. And an interesting note that we saw at this stage was the quality of presentation could often affect the quality of feedback that would be received, and designers were very conscious of this. And so noting that they were very visual in their particular studio, and if they didn't have slides, even if it wasn't necessarily relevant to the thing in question, they might not get as much engagement out of their audience. Then finally, exchanging feedback is the fourth stage, and this is sort of where the magic happens. It's where feedback goes from providers to receivers, and then receivers are trying to mainly capture at this stage. And so a representative quote is, we'd all play it in a space together and then just give free-form feedback, just anything that comes to mind. And if we're looking for something specific, we might call it out. And as somebody that has been running one of these sessions, I'd just have a notebook just writing down things like crazy. And there was a lot of comments at this stage of sort of the social impacts occasionally of peer feedback, where people would potentially start giving the same kinds of notes or the same kinds of ideas because everybody else was. And then also noting that there's sort of interesting potential power dynamics of more junior employees might ignore some feedback or might not be as aware of what is worth paying attention to. I'm trying to speed up. Actually, I should be fine. So the fifth stage is processing. So this is where feedback is digested, collated, might be revised, might be translated from physical notes to digital. And then also where things like judgments are being made. Is that valuable? Am I going to ignore that? Stuff like that. So representative quote of that. The next thing I was doing was processing all that information and then coalescing it into good action items and takeaways and ways that we can improve the game that we're working on. And a really interesting thing that we noted here is while most of the rest of the stages have sort of variations in formality, so they have informal methods and formal methods, the processing stage was almost exclusively informal and very rarely had sort of an explicit process defined at a studio level or at a team level. And we thought that was kind of notably interesting. And then finally, the sixth stage is acting on feedback. This is where you execute on the decisions you were made. You might change something, maybe the whole thing, maybe a little thing, maybe nothing at all. And you also might completely scrap your game. So basically, I ended up redesigning the app icon to match more the visual style, but still have some of the heart of the concept that I came up with beforehand. Or occasionally we throw it out and just completely change everything based on feedback. And it's hard when it happens, but it does happen sometimes. And so it's a bit of a whirlwind. There's a lot more detail on all those different stages in the paper. I highly recommend you check it out. Overall, we have this process, and so I wanted to give a couple quick insights about how we might use it. And so we've been talking about potentially using it to drive intervention design. So for example, in the planning stage, creating digital feedback portfolios that could help curate the feedback given by people in the past and help you select who's going to actually be on your team. For exchanging feedback, you could provide guiding questions to sort of target the feedback that's going to happen within a particular session towards specific needs. And then in the processing stage, formalizing that process that to the moment is currently not formalized, and also better understanding how we might structure those. And then another thing we've been thinking about is what kind of outcomes do we want to be looking at if we're looking to do interventions at these different stages in different parts of the process? Are we looking at game success? Are we looking at employee satisfaction? Are we looking at player experience and how happier game designers create more fun games? And then two other pieces of quick future work. One thing you might have noticed is we sort of have a small and a medium-sized studio, but we have no idea what the indie context looks like. When you're a team of 2 people, who is a peer? Is it just the other person that works for you? Do you go to a community? And how does that kind of play into this kind of cycle? And then the other one that I would love to solve, if anybody here is willing to get their legal department angry, is the AAA scale. We've tried. It's very hard. But how does scale of a studio really impact these kinds of processes when like your art department is the size of one of these studios we talked to. And also, it was notable in the 2 studios we talked to, we didn't hear a lot about crunch. It just didn't really happen at these kinds of studios, but we know that is a thing that does happen. And it would be great to know, like, does feedback get thrown under the bus when crunch has to happen? And we just don't have insight on that. So if anybody would like to help me get into a AAA studio, let me know. But with that, I'll thank you and take questions.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 questions.
So maybe I'm Simon Herman, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. So maybe I have missed it, but the type of feedback that you're asking for is mostly for an individual. Is that correct? It's not like a group is presenting and then they get feedback.
We defined it as feedback on a work product, and whether or not it was a team pitching to the whole studio or one person like pitching to their neighbor, we didn't really make a distinction. And I don't. So the vast majority of what we saw was more that kind of drive-by, talking to your neighbor kinds of feedback. So if I had to give it a number of what was more common, I would say that. But it was usually being received by at least one person, but sometimes there were like multiple people in a team, and like one was taking notes while one was fielding questions. So there was a bit of a difference there. Yeah.
Okay, just a small follow-up question. Did you have any programmers who were searching for feedback? In software engineering, there's like the formal process of peer review and something like that?
Yeah, so we didn't have any software engineers by design. So our goal was essentially anybody more or less titled designer, and that's more or less what we got. At the larger studio, we did get a couple other people, like one was more of a QA sort of position, and then we did get a little engineering in that one, and then another one was like a community manager, but they also ran playtesting. So there was a bit of like multi-hat wearing that we did experience, but we didn't talk to any specific devs, but it would be good to think about how the broader studio also was affected by the sense.
Catherine Gerling, KU Leuven. Thanks for your talk. I think for all of us who teach game development, this is hugely inspirational. So I was just wondering, have you thought at all about taking that methodology, the structures that you find, and adapting it so that it can also be used in an educational setting?
Yeah, and so Amy is continuing to do that. She graduated. She went to Memphis. So keep following her. She has this great tool called Peer Presents, which actually facilitates peer feedback during presentations and kind of works almost like a crit, but also a presentation. It's really cool. I use it in my class. I can show you. But one thing we are looking at in that, trying to keep that work going, is actually looking more at that process problem of the digesting feedback is a thing that often doesn't have a lot of pedagogy for it already. And we would love to kind of develop both on the pedagogical side, but also potentially help the industrial side as well. So.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you very much.